BookTok is ruining reading. It's turning reading into nothing more than an aesthetic. Art comments on, quote, the cultural phenomenon on Instagram of books in terms of being almost like an accessory. And Penguin has even published a blog post with the most Instagrammable book covers, captioning this as books that you can buy, take photos of to spice up your feed. And this discourse is pretty prevalent. People arguing that it shouldn't be about covers, but what's inside, you know, the traditional saying of don't judge a book by its cover. And yes, and I get the sentiment, but it's not like these two things, book object and text, are entirely disconnected, because books are inherently visual things. And it's not me saying that we don't cross a line. Obviously the text is important and the text will always be the most important part of the book, but we can't disregard the fact that like the text and the book object are inherently connected and that we can't separate one from the other. Like, books are intrinsically visual things. The text is held within the book object. Like, you can't have the text without the book object. A visual and material thing must be held in order to extract meaning from it. Like, you can't extract the meaning of this without actually having the book object. You cannot have the text without the book. And think about even the process of reading in the most basic sense. For those of you who've read this, you'll know that I'm choosing this book very intentionally as a prop. Like, think even about the process of reading. In the most literal sense, it's about looking at a book, looking at words on the page and decoding meaning from these visual symbols. And so of course it makes sense that visuals should be important to the book. If the font, for example, is colourful or particularly like superfluous, that's going to change the way that you read it, because the process of reading is a visual thing. And actually historically the attention to like the aesthetic quality of a book was so much more pronounced. At the Bodleian Library they've done book exhibitions since the 17th century, and this is where like very impressive books from the Bodleian collection will be displayed in the Duke Humphreys Library. And I've read the catalogue of these from the 19th century, and these catalogues pay huge attention to the visual qualities of the books, the binding, how the book looks, what's kind of impressive about it materially as opposed to the text. Like, the text is an afterthought in the catalogue entries. And Darnton reminds us that, quote, if you read advertisements for books in 18th century journals, you'll be struck by the emphasis on the primary material of literature, meaning how it's been printed, for example, the kind of paper, which Darnton points out would be completely unthinkable today. Like, and just book collection more broadly, like people who collect books, that's so much more connected to the book object than it is to the text. Which kind of we see if we read Walter Benjamin's essay on book collecting, for example. So it's age old, this focus on aesthetics and books, the importance of the book object, and yet we demean it when it comes to TikTok. The focus on visuals and aesthetic quality on BookTok is seen as disreputable and ridiculous, when actually it's so historically grounded in the way that we've approached books since their inception. And honestly, it's definitely a discourse that I used to fall into when I was a child, when I was young, when I was just starting to read like books without pictures. I used to think it was shallow to read books with nice covers, or even choose books that had nice covers. I very intentionally went for books with ugly covers because I took that saying, you know, don't judge a book by its cover, very much to heart. Part of me thought that an ugly book would actually be better than a beautiful book. I also looked down on books with illustrations because of that trajectory that like you get fewer and fewer illustrations the older you get. So like you start with picture books and then you go to middle grade books which have some pictures, and then increasingly the pictures peter off until you've got books with no illustrations at all. And that's kind of categorised as the most serious and important form of literature. And falling very much into that model, I was very against illustrations. I was like, I'm not going to read a book with illustrations. The illustrations aren't needed for the text. Until I had a conversation with an English teacher when I was maybe like 16, and she made an excellent point on why the Dickens illustrations, why those iconic illustrations in the Dickens books are so important to the process of reading. And like, what's reading a Dickens book without those iconic illustrations? It becomes part of the reading experience. The other great example is Alice in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll was so attentive to the illustrations that John Tenniel did for him, so much so that when the first edition was printed he actually had it retracted because the ink was slightly too thick and the illustrations didn't look how he wanted to, so he refused to have that book sold. Like, he took to heart that line in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, what use is a book with no pictures? All I'm trying to illustrate is that visuals are a key part of book culture and the reading experience, and kind of culturally have been important, so we shouldn't diminish that.
I think the other thing which is really important to remember is that TikTok is itself a visual platform. It's based on video, and so it makes sense that visual aesthetic will prosper here when talking about books.
And actually this ridiculing of aesthetics, which we see on BookTok, stretches so much further. I recently read Maggie Nelson's book Bluets, which explained this beautifully, really eloquently. So John Milton, one of the greatest English writers was blind, and he was the author of Paradise Lost. He wrote Comus, Masque performed at Ludlow, which is in my top 5 pieces of literature ever. And historically what people have said about Milton is that because he was blind, he wasn't distracted by the visual world. And Democritus, similarly and supposedly, he intentionally blinded himself so that he could focus entirely on achieving intellectual enlightenment. And kind of the discourse here is you negate the physical world so that you can focus on thoughts as the most important part of the self. But Maggie Nelson argues visuals are important and that we shouldn't diminish them. She argues it beautifully, and I'd direct you towards her book because she'll say it much better than I will. But what she's really emphasising is that colour, and specifically in this case blue, is kind of important and spiritual and can help us think. I suppose I want to challenge the idea that book covers and this focus on visuals is inherently a bad thing, because in the same way that Maggie Nelson says that the colour blue can help us to access spiritual thoughts, can help us to think, the book object that we read from and the cover that we see can impact and influence the way that we also read the text. So having nice covers, I would say, is actually hugely valuable, and if anything, BookTok becomes a reminder of this, because by centralising the book object, by giving it a kind of reverence in this visual space, we remind ourselves of that very integral connection between book object and text, and how the book object itself can affect the way that we read. I actually particularly love the culture of multiple editions that we now have, and different editions having different aesthetics, people buying really lovely editions and beautiful copies of their books to then display. And because we do have more editions to choose from nowadays, it becomes a way to kind of personalise your bookshelf, personalise your book collection, which feels eons away from the kind of very ugly book covers that we had in the early 2000s that I definitely remember for the children's books that I read. Just look at the basic paperback version of Little by Edward Carey. This cover is stunning. But if you don't like this, you can buy the hardback, which looks like this, and the American edition looks like this. And these choices, these different editions, I think it's part of the process of you reading that book, because when you display a book, you're showing that that book was important to you, that you've read it, and when you display a beautiful edition of that book, you're further displaying the importance of that book to you, I think. And I think there's something just really beautiful about that.
The other offshoot of that actually on BookTok more recently is the trend of bookbinding and rebinding your favourite books. For example, I rebound my copy of Far From the Madding Crowd, and by going in and spending quite an extortionate amount of time adorning, decorating one of your favourite books, you kind of indicate to yourself and others that that book is worthy of you spending the time doing that.
And to kind of elucidate and extract the point that I'm trying to make, I want to use an example from the early modern period. I just finished my master's in early modern literature. Forgive me that kind of early modern literature is so at the forefront of my mind that it's why I link everything back to you. But the early modern period, of course, was the beginning of modern book culture, because it's the aftermath of the printing press. Books are more readily available. And Heidi Hackel, whose book is wonderful, definitely would recommend it if you are interested in this, points out that male readers would traditionally use annotation as a way of showing that a book was important. So if a book was important to a reader, you would find it... Oh, what's it called? There's a great phrase I read from a critic. I want to find it now in my notes. Blackening of the page, and the more blackened that the page was, the more ink that has kind of been scrawled in the margins, the more underlinings that there are, the more important that book was to somebody. Annotation, however, was not the way that female readers would traditionally show that a book was important. Instead, they would use book bindings. Hackel explores this wonderfully, and also by conducting this research and sharing this book, she is rebelling against a model of bibliography, which is predominantly focused on, as Kate Ozment says, a history of men and their books. But she points out that female readers would often use binding as a way of showing that a book was important to them. So, for example, Queen Elizabeth was known for having these elaborate red velvet and satin book bindings. That's how she would bind the books in her collection.
So this is in Heidi Hackel's book. The books in this collection impressed a foreign visitor, all bound in velvet of different colours, though chiefly red with clasps of gold and silver. Some have pearls and precious stones set in their bindings.
Also very common for women to embroider the covers of books if they really enjoyed them. So this becomes a visual indicator of how important a book was to somebody. Not just whether they were owned, but also how they were bound. Because book selling was very different in the early modern period to what we get today. So today, most stuff will be covered by the publisher. The publisher will organise editing, but also also printing, binding and distribution, whereas most of those things were separate in the early modern period. So when somebody bought a book, they would first of all buy just like the pages, the papers, and then they would take them to a binder who would bind it into a book for them. And people tended to have like a signature book binder that they would go to and get all of their books bound at. And of course, as you would expect, different types of binding cost different amounts. So you could get like a very elaborate, very expensive binding, or you could get something like just done in parchment, for example. Like the expenses were hugely variable. And the kind of binding that you would go for, of course, like declares something about how important that book is to you. Because if you choose a very expensive vellum binding, then you're declaring that that book is important enough to be bound. Like that's practice we see back in the medieval period with illuminated manuscripts. I'm sure you've heard of illuminated manuscripts, but an illuminated manuscript is where you've got decorative gold foiling or silver foiling, which adds this like beautiful iridescence to the paper. Illuminated manuscripts were traditionally only for devotional text and theological text, so that becomes this visual declaration of the importance of that text. And don't tell me that that process is not similar to special editions, and people buying special editions and displaying special editions as a way of showing that that book is important to them. Like when on BookTok you see somebody showing a special edition of a book, I think it's a wonderful ode back to kind of this early book culture where women and also men would have these elaborate bindings to show that that these books meant something to them. I love that BookTok and Bookstagram and BookTube have encouraged publishers to focus on making more Instagrammable covers. Of course, as soon as we use Instagram as an adjective, it becomes something shallow, but attention to the book object, attention to kind of having and owning a beautiful copy of a book goes back to earliest English book culture. It is certainly not ruining reading, because this has happened for centuries, and indeed is a part of so-called high culture reading. Like it was kind of the wealthiest people with the most important pieces of devotional literature and high literature which were being bound in this way. I think it's worth saying that it does also feel like a slightly gendered sort of ridicule. I mean, if we go back to that quote that I mentioned at the beginning, this critique of books being an accessory and books being treated as an accessory online, like the word accessory is largely associated with women. Since 1896, the word has been used to refer to small articles of women's clothing, women's dress, used in women's fashion. And indeed, most critiques of kind of these beautiful books are loosely but significantly connected to books predominantly read by women. Now, this isn't to say that women are the only people to read novels, like far from that, and that is an assumption that we definitely need to like move past and overcome. But we must also remember that 80% of people who buy novels are women in the UK, the USA and Canada, which has also been backed up by Nielsen book research, and something which Helen Taylor's book Why Women Read Fiction really elucidates, which is an excellent book, by the way. Indeed, Ian McEwan says, when women stop reading, the novel will be dead. And this isn't me saying that only women read novels, but it does pose a question. This focus on having beautiful book covers and beautiful book designs, the countdowns and reveals of these book covers are usually for fiction, they're usually for novels. And so is it surprising that this is something which can be ridiculed sometimes? I think it's especially interesting when we situate it again back in early modern culture. Yes, both men and women would get books rebound, and the binding of a book can tell us how important a book was, but as Heidi Hackel says, it is something which is largely associated with female readers. I think it's something which is important, I think it's something which is valuable, and I think we should be embracing this culture where the book object has become central in combination with the text, and that the book object and the text are working together, that the book object is able to visually portray for readers through different editions the kind of the importance of the book to that reader. BookTok is a visual platform, and Neil Postman says that we are a visual culture. Obviously, the content of books being discussed, we see book reviews, which is kind of the most important part, but we also see in tandem the book object being shown. The aesthetic space on BookTok and the focus on the visual components of the book themselves become a way for readers to show their affinity to the book. The book object is a way to adorn the book, and using visuals a way to show respect to the text inside. I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on all of this and kind of what you think about the visual focus of BookTok. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you have more than just a productive week.